นั้นแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็ได้ยินเสียงสัตว์ตัวที่สองร้องว่ามาดูเถิดและมีม้าอีกตัวหนึ่งออกไปเป็นม้าสีแดงสดผู้ที่ขี่ม้าตัวนี้ได้รับอนุญาตให้นำสันติสุขไปจากแผ่นดินโลกเพื่อให้คนทั้งปวงรบราฆ่าฟันกันและผู้นี้ได้รับดาบใหญ่เล่มหนึ่งและเมื่อพระองค์ทรงแกะตราดวงที่สามนั้นแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็ได้ยินสัตว์ตัวที่สามร้องว่ามาดูเถิดแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็แลเห็นและดูเถิดมีม้าดำตัวหนึ่งและผู้ที่ขี่ม้านั้นถือตราชูแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็ได้ยินเสียงออกมาจากท่ามกลางสัตว์ทั้งสี่นั้นว่าข้าวสาลีราคาธนานละ1 เดนาริอันข้าวบาเล3 ธนานต่อ1 เดนาริอันและเจ้าอย่าทำอันตรายแก่น้ำมันและน้ำองุ่นและเมื่อพระองค์ทรงแกะตราดวงที่สี่นั้นแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็ได้ยินเสียงสัตว์ตัวที่สี่ร้องว่ามาดูเถิดแล้วข้าพเจ้าก็แลเห็นและดูเถิดมีม้าศึกและมีม้าสีดุขอโทษค่ะแล้วข้าพเจ้าเห็นและนี่แหละมีม้าสีกะเรียวตัวหนึ่งผู้ที่ขี่ม้าตัวนี้มีชื่อว่ามัจจุราชและแดนคนตายก็ติดตามมาด้วยพระองค์ทรงให้ทั้งสองนี้มีอำนาจเหนือแผ่นดินโลก1 ใน 4ส่วนที่จะทำลายได้ด้วยคมดาบด้วยความอดอยากด้วยโรคระบาดและด้วยสัตว์ร้ายแห่งแผ่นดินเมื่อพระองค์ทรงแกะตราดวงที่5ข้าพเจ้าก็เห็นดวงวิญญาณทั้งหลายที่ใต้แท่นบูชาซึ่งเป็นวิญญาณของคนทั้งหลายที่ถูกฆ่าเพราะพระวจนะของพระเจ้าและเพราะคำพยานที่เขายึดถือนั้นเขาเหล่านั้นร้องเสียงดังว่าโอ้ข้าแต่องค์พระผู้เป็นเจ้าผู้บริสุทธิ์และสัตย์จริงอีกนานเท่าใดพระองค์จึงจะทรงพิพากษาและตอบสนองให้เลือดของเราต่อคนทั้งหลายที่อยู่ในโลกแล้วพระองค์ประทานเสื้อสีขาวแก่คนเหล่านั้นทุกคนและทรงกำชับเขาให้หยุดพักต่อไปอีกหน่อยจนกว่าเพื่อนผู้รับใช้ของเขาและพวกพี่น้องของเขาจะถูกฆ่าเหมือนกันกับเขานั้นจนครบจำนวนและข้าพเจ้าได้เห็นเมื่อพระองค์ทรงแกะตราดวงที่6นั้นแล้วดูเถิดมีแผ่นดินไหวใหญ่โตดวงอาทิตย์ก็กลายเป็นมืดดำดุจผ้ากระสอบขนสัตว์และดวงจันทร์ก็กลายเป็นเหมือนเลือดและดวงดาวมากมายในฟ้าสวรรค์ตกลงบนแผ่นดินเหมือนต้นมะเดื่ออันหวั่นไหวด้วยลมกล้าจนทำให้ฝนหล่นลงไปทันสุดท้องฟ้าก็หายไปเหมือนกับหนังสือที่เขาม้วนขึ้นไปหมดและภูเขาทุกลูกและเกาะทุกเกาะก็เลื่อนไปจากที่เดิมแล้วกษัตริย์ทั้งหลายในโลกพวกคนใหญ่คนโตเศรษฐีนายทหารใหญ่ผู้มีอำนาจและทุกคนทั้งที่เป็นทาสและเป็นอิสระก็ซ่อนตัวอยู่ในถ้ำและโขดหินตามภูเขาพวกเขาร้องบอกกับภูเขาและโขดหินว่าจงล้มทับเราเถิดจงซ่อนเราไว้ให้พ้นจากพระพักของพระองค์ผู้ประทับอยู่บนพระที่นั่งและให้พ้นจากพระพิโรธของพระเมสสโปดกนั้นเพราะว่าวันสำคัญแห่งพระพิโรธของพระองค์มาถึงแล้วและผู้ใดจะทนอยู่ได้เล่าขอพระเจ้าทรงอวยพรทุกท่านที่ได้ยินได้ฟังพระธรรมต่อไปเป็นพระธรรมเทศนาจากอาจารย์ปีเตอร์กับ The Seals of Judgment
Not mistaken if the passage looks familiar. It is last week's passage. So with that, I'm going to go straight to God's Word. I will not do a reading. Just want to say that we will definitely get into the seal judgments in the book of Revelation. And, we started talking about this chapter last week, but we really didn't go into the chapter, right? We just focus more on the general idea of judgment instead of, what are these seal judgments? We didn't necessarily go there. So this time we're going to dive into these verses and then learn more about the judgments that God brings as the seals from the scroll is open. But before doing that, I first want to respond to two questions that I somewhat gathered, meaning, it wasn't explicit, it was more indirect. These are questions I sort of gathered from my Wednesday noon prayer meeting and Bible study. You see, before I preach every Sunday on Revelation, the members of this Wednesday group pretty much gets an early preview or a work in progress of what I'm going to say on Sunday. And thanks to them, I actually get an early review of the upcoming sermon because, the Wednesday group is a more interactive group. It's a small group setting where I can get reactions, questions, violent objections, feedback of that sort of kind that I'm not going to get while I'm preaching. So the group has been a blessing for me in that sense because they give me a chance to, in a way, make revisions, adjustments, to what I need to say so that I can address whatever issue that was in the passage more clearly. So before going into the sealed judgments, I want to take a few minutes to address two important questions. One question is, why is it really necessary to study the details of the judgments in Revelation? In other words, why read and reflect on things that don't seem very uplifting and instead can actually make people more depressed, and down and sad? The second question relates back to the idea of judgment. Why can't God just forgive? Why can't He just let go? In other words, is there even a real need for God to judge? He is God. He can do whatever He wants. I will answer that question in a different way from how I answered it last week. Here goes. Now, I can understand how it may be depressing and maybe even traumatic to witness these intense images of judgment in Revelation. The language and the ideas of judgment dominate Revelation and span from chapter 6, moving on up to chapter 20, where it reaches sort of a peak or a climax. I get that we can be uncomfortable, reading this kind of material. It is easier for us to avoid this. It is easier for me to avoid this. It makes sense that churches normally avoid doing sermons on these middle chapters. Now, some people may say that what is shown here is not worthy of how we know God as a merciful and gracious God, as a God of loving kindness. Unfortunately, avoiding the idea of God's judgment would actually make us misunderstand God's character. You see, it is impossible to avoid the topic of judgment. Jesus actually spoke of the topic of judgment and hell much more than the topic of heaven itself. But even so, let's say I don't like thinking of God as a God of judgment. I may say to you something like, I prefer to think of God as, loving and compassionate, not a God who has wrath and actually gives out punishment. I don't think of God as that. That would be like me saying, I prefer to think of myself as, 6'4" with lots of hair, great physical shape, with basketball skills that make me the Filipino version of Steph Curry. Or, that would be like me saying that the best diabetic diet for me would be a diet of ice cream, French fries, noodles and rice, even sticky rice, and soda. That is not diet. All I'm saying is, what I prefer to think of God, what you all prefer to think of God, about God, it doesn't really matter. What matters is reality. Reality is more important than what you desire reality to be. Judgment is unavoidable because it is part of the reality of who God is. The thing is, even if we try, we can't even make God more attractive to people if we take away and not mention God's judgment. Because that means we believe that God is not concerned with what is good. That means we believe that God is not concerned with what is right and what is wrong. Now, that is a total misunderstanding of who God is. What we do need to understand about God is that God will eventually bring an end to all evil, all wickedness, and everything that is wrong in this world. All sin and all evil will get their due punishment and be brought to an end. The bottom line reason for judgment is quite simple. Justice. We all like the thought and sound of justice, right? That's a good word. When a person is accused and charged and found guilty of murder, we all want to see that person receive the appropriate punishment for what the person did. We want the jury or the judge to make sure that the person gets the treatment or punishment that matches or corresponds to what they did to this other person. The reason for that is we actually have a built-in desire in our hearts for justice. It is a desire given to us by God who knows perfect justice. Now, the judgment that God brings, it may possibly bring people to repentance. And that's a good thing, because that is God's desire. But not all will repent. And because of that, there is such a thing as retributive punishment. It is punishment that is not for rehabilitation, but instead it is for retribution. In other words, it is simply punishment that fits the crime or the evil that is committed. Now, of course, we're not saying we don't want people to be rehabilitated. I mean, the issue is much deeper than that. As an example, I could say that, when a parent maybe, just maybe, when a parent loses a child, no matter how old, and the loss happened because the child's life was taken by someone else, the parents would probably cry for justice. People may say to them, going after that murderer will not bring their child back. I mean, it's true. It won't. But the parents will be glad to see the murderer behind bars and receive what is due. So if you're a father or mother who lost a child in this way, I mean, that's a very big loss. We think of things like that as events, right, that are just not supposed to happen. Your desire would be that the person who committed the crime experience some sort of appropriate loss or consequence for what the person did. And we would actually be disgusted by a judge who would release and let this person off the hook. I mean, that a judge might say, well, no one else was endangered. It was an act of passion. I don't think the person's going to kill again, so maybe it's okay to, just let the person back into society. We would actually be disgusted by this judge and think that he is neither wise nor good. We would think of this judge as not just, but unjust. We would think of this judge as not worthy of his position in the court. Now, if we can think of earthly judges this way, how much more should this be true of God who knows true justice? If God does not bring wickedness to an end with its due punishment, God would neither be wise nor good. God would be unjust. God would be unworthy of our admiration and worship. I heard that in communities where a lot of people are oppressed, the thought and even the longing of God's judgment is looked at as appropriate and acceptable. For them, the thought of God's judgment and the sense of future vindication may even be uplifting or edifying. But for people like us who are not necessarily outwardly oppressed, I mean, that's as far as I know, maybe we don't really have a good idea of how deep human evil is. Maybe we don't get how evil is so ingrained in the fabric of our society and in ourselves. It may be harder to think of judgment and punishment when we have no major experience or feeling of oppression. But for those who do feel oppression and evil, it is easier for them to understand that justice needs to happen. And we desire judgment to be carried out by a God who knows justice, a God who is worthy of our honor and devotion, and we know is definitely just. So, bottom line, why judgment? Justice, yes. Knowing that, we can now move on. Revelation 6, the seal judgments. It is called the seal judgments because as every seal of the scroll is opened, the words of judgment that is pronounced on the scroll come alive out of the page. It's like these words come out like the images, and they reveal themselves to John. This chapter, of course, is most famous for its presentation of the four horsemen of the apocalypse as the ones bringing terrifying judgment. We got a picture of that. Oh, four horses. The first four seals that were opened released these four horses of judgment. Now, different people regard these judgments as either happening in the past, some in the present, and some say these are still all for the future, depending on what theological take they bring to this book. But what I would say is that the judgments brought by the four horsemen and other seals are judgments that Jesus said would describe as happening in the present age. Jesus said in Mark 13, verses 7 to 8, "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are just the beginnings of birth pains." That means the presence of these kinds of judgments do not necessarily mean it's the end. These are just the beginning of birth pains. So it's not yet the end, but these are signs pointing to the coming end. Now, the identity of the four horsemen, it's actually subject to debate. And, I've been telling people, it's important that we have grace to the various interpretations that people may have. For me, they seem to be angels of judgment. And the reason I say that is that the four horsemen reminds us of the Old Testament passage in Zechariah chapter 1, verses 8 to 11, and chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. I have the one in chapter 1. It says, "During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man mounted on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. I asked, 'What are these, my Lord?' The angel who was talking to me answered, 'I will show you what they are.' Then the man standing among the myrtle trees explained, 'They are the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth.' And they reported to the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees, 'We have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace.'" The point there is that in Zechariah, the riders on four different colors of horses represent the Lord's patrol on duty that report back to him about what's going on in the world. Now, the images of these horses are actually meant to be terrifying to people reading Revelation in the first century. I mean, were they sort of terrifying looking? I know it's just an artist's drawing. So on and so forth. So that means to us, we may need to update the imagery a little bit. Instead of horses, you may think of them in our time as fighter jets or helicopter gunships or cruise missiles, something of that nature. Devastating instruments of war. The intention is that these images are meant to be frightening to those who are not followers of Christ. The identity of the rider of the white horse has a few candidates. Some say it is actually Christ on the white horse, because in Revelation 19, verse 11, it is actually the image of Christ on a white horse. Now, others say the rider is actually the Antichrist. For our purposes, I will stick with having the rider of the white horse as one of God's angels, like the one shown in our Zechariah passage earlier. The fact that the rider carries a bow, maybe we could get back to that picture. You can see the rider carrying a bow, the one on your left. It's actually a significant thing because the bow is used in the Old Testament as an image of conquest. It is an image of an army of invaders coming in for the kill to take over your land. In the first century, the best archers who were also mounted on horses were a people group called the Parthians, who were very skillful in killing and defeating even the Roman legions. So in that time period, the conquest from the Parthians was a big concern as they were more than a match against the Roman armies. So for our time period, I mean, try to imagine an army that can go through our country's defenses and invade where you live, and you can't do anything about it. Now, the second seal shows us the rider of the red horse. I heard the word sedan, right? Right. This rider carries a sword which is used as a symbol of war over 100 times in the Old Testament. That means this rider is bringing war and bloodshed. What makes this horse of war and bloodshed different from the white horse in conquest? The difference is that the war and bloodshed brought about by the second rider, in a sense, includes civil war, which is considered the worst kind of war. You know, it's a war that may include killing people from your own country, your countrymen, your family, family members, and even some relatives. So that is a devastating kind of war. The next rider on the black horse represents famine. Famine normally follows war, and it is said that more people die in famine than the war that is responsible for the famine. The scales that this rider holds, you can see the black horse there with the scales, that is used to weigh products in the market in order to figure out the right price. Now, the prices mentioned in the scripture, which is, a quart of wheat for a day's wage and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wage, they're actually all very expensive. It is about 15 times the usual price of wheat and barley at the time. That means people will go hungry since people can't even afford to get enough food for the family. Wheat and barley represent, the staple food of their diet. Like most of you guys, it would be rice. It is recorded that in places where the first century, such as, there was famine, such as a country like Egypt, many children actually died due to famine. And they have an estimated child mortality rate of 50%. So, during times of war and conquest, there are areas that won't be able to handle the food shortage that normally follows. Revelation 6:6 says, "Do not damage the oil and wine." Now, that may mean that this judgment promotes what people may call economic injustice. The reason is non-basic products like olive oil and wine were more profitable to grow than wheat and barley. And the rich value the production much more as they're more profitable while sacrificing the production of basic foods. But sparing the oil and wine could also mean that this is also a sign of God's mercy. That's because in ancient warfare, invaders normally destroyed staple crops, but not long-term plants like olive trees or vines. Because if you destroy olive trees, it takes 17 years to get a new olive harvest from new trees. And the same thing sort of happens if you permanently destroy vines that produce grapes. So a conqueror who wants to take over the land would not normally destroy the productivity of the land. Otherwise, it'll be a useless land for a good amount of time. So all I'm saying is in this kind of judgment, there is mercy from God, since the judgment is not about total destruction. It is a short-term judgment as opposed to a long-term judgment. Now, the last horse is the pale horse. The word in the original language actually means green. But when the word is used as a color for the complexion, the translation pale is actually correct. It is the word used to describe the color of corpses, of dead people. they're kind of pale, right? So it makes sense that the rider of the pale horse is called Death in Hades. This rider simply brings death, whether it is from the plague or pestilence or famine or any other reason. Again, the impact of these visions of the four horsemen is to present judgments that are just the beginning of birth pains. That means these events, as terrible as they are just warnings of greater judgments to come. And for Christians who experience suffering from these events, like Christian victims of war, famine, and pestilence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they suffered due to their sin. These judgments may not be necessarily meant for them, because some people argue it may be more of a case of God bringing corporate judgment on societies as a whole, because you can see examples of that in the Old Testament, of God bringing judgment to the nations. The main goal of these judgments is to both deliver what these societies deserve because of the wickedness and sins, and also to encourage those who don't know God to repent. Now, all of this makes sense right after I talked about judgments earlier. You can make sense of the logic behind all that. The fifth seal shows us Christian martyrs portrayed as sacrifices in the temple. Let's see. Okay. Of course, it's an artist's conception. Their souls were under the altar because in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, that is the place where the priests poured the blood of their sacrifices. These martyrs cry out, how long? Which is a cry that appears in the Old Testament as an appeal for justice or vindication. They died because they were condemned by others for serving God, and they eagerly await for God to bring justice. Does God hear their cries? The answer is yes, because Revelation 8:4 says that the prayers of the saints are rising before God like incense. But God says that he will not do anything until the full amount of martyrs are complete. That means more Christians who testify to God are supposed to die for the faith before God will execute final judgment. The suffering witness of Christian believers is actually necessary for the fullness of the Gentiles to come in and among from the nations, and then which is followed by the final conversion of many Jewish people to faith in Christ. You all know the saying, right? That the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. I mean, that was true in the early church. That was true all throughout the history of the church, and that is true still today. That means evangelism happens when there are people who sacrifice themselves and do what it takes to spread the gospel, including giving up their lives. The gospel must be brought to all people before the end. Matthew 24:14 says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." I imagine there are still people groups that still haven't heard of the gospel. In the past, I've heard of Christian groups that talk about sending missionaries to countries of what is called the 1040 window. Is that sort of familiar to you guys? That is the region of the world in the eastern and western hemisphere located between 10 and 40 degrees north of the equator. Countries in this region have the least access to Christian message and have areas that contain the highest concentration of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists. And I'm sure you heard the expression that if we want to quicken the return of Christ, we need to step up in terms of evangelism to many areas, like the 1040 window, where the gospel hasn't been normally preached. The question is, for the church as a whole, are there Christians who are willing to witness to these areas? Are we doing our part in supporting the gospel witness in these countries, we as a church? A quick answer to that is yes, because one of the countries in the so-called 1040 window is Thailand, a country that we sort of support. The question is, what if we can do more? It's a question. In addition, we should not actually neglect the Christian witness that is needed for areas where, people are Christian, but maybe they're Christian sort of in name only. I heard that there's a time when America was the country that sent the most missionaries to evangelize the world. Nowadays, it seems like major parts of America needs to be re-evangelized again, especially with the rise of people who say they have none or no religious affiliation. So now you have people from other countries, especially the Koreans, sending their own missionaries to re-evangelize America. But regardless of where the church does its mission work, are we interested and ready to take the gospel to places where it needs to be heard? I mean, even in our own neighborhood. If we are followers of Jesus, are we ready to do our part and see what we can do to contribute to the gospel, including suffering for the sake of the gospel? Now, going on to the sixth seal. The sixth seal shows us an unusually big earthquake, much more than any earthquake we have seen or experienced here in California. There are other instances in the Old Testament where you can find an end-time earthquake like this, but there's also mention of the sun turning black and the moon red. What's mentioned there is definitely not your typical solar or lunar eclipse. Then there's the stars in the sky falling in the mountains and islands being removed from their place. Of course, you can believe that all the stars in the sky, they can literally fall on Earth. But you can also take a more metaphorical approach. But with that, you still need to say that all the events described here are catastrophic. It is world-ending. It shows the entire cosmos coming to an end. And because of that, people of all types, a king, a prince, general, rich or poor, slave or free, they recognize the judgment of God and the wrath of the Lamb as they flee by going into the caves and mountains. They cry out, "Who can withstand the day of wrath brought upon us?" The answer to all of that is in Revelation 7, which we will take up next week. But an important thing we learn from Revelation 6 is that God is sovereign throughout history. Terrible things may happen or may have already happened, but we can be assured that God uses these events to move history forward and lead us to full salvation. And in that future salvation, we can expect full vindication, full justice. Things that are wrong in this world will be made right. We can expect justice. Evil and wickedness will be no more. And the events here in Revelation 6, they point to all that and more. With that, let us pray. We give you thanks, O Lord, for these images of judgment. As difficult as it is to see them and experience them, we take them, Lord, as a sign of your perfect character of justice, your perfect righteousness. So, Father, continue to encourage us that you are working towards this goal, that everything going on, Lord, is part of your big plan. Help us, Lord, to continue to discern what we need to do, especially in terms of spreading the gospel. Lord, this we pray in Jesus' name.